Well, that's interesting. I guess you have to start somewhere, and where I began is where a lot of people begin, I think, in childhood, just writing little things about trips I'd take to Boston with my grandmother or whatever. And then in high school, I became involved in the literary magazine by submitting poetry. That was the first time I actually published poetry. And, you know, those were those kind of very introspective and moaning sort of high school teenager poems. And I took a journalism course because initially I wanted to be a journalist. I loved writing news stories and human interest stories. And I remember the guidance counselor sort of directing me and through my parents toward a career as a teacher, because that was far more acceptable. And it's interesting because women, I think, have made more strides in journalism than in a lot of other professions. But it was kind of a conservative school, and, you know, that was sort of what was expected. And in college, I also wrote for the literary magazine and the newspaper. I didn't really write poetry in college. I read a lot of poetry. I was a literature major, and so I was always having to read. I mean, we read everything as far as 1950 or so. Once we got to the Beats and all of contemporary poetry, it was completely excluded from the curriculum. Hopefully it isn't today, but in the late 60s and 70s, it wasn't even discussed. And that was, you know, that was kind of a flaw in that. But I read a lot of contemporary poetry on my own, and I was part of a literature club on campus, and we brought people to read poetry. And, you know, so we had some contemporary poetry poets coming to campus. But I was also going to a lot of readings in college that were sponsored by the Poetry Association in Worcester, Worcester County Poetry Association. And those people were, you know, some of the best poets nationally and internationally coming into Worcester to read. So that was part of my education. But as far as publishing poetry, I didn't really. I published, it was the time of political activism, and I published an article, a kind of human interest story on the Free Breakfast for Children program. This was before there were federally mandated breakfasts in the schools for poor and low-income children. And I was a volunteer. There were lots of college students who were volunteering for this program that was begun by different Worcester area people. And you know, there was another writer involved in that. I remember Edward P. Jones, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel The Known World, was a Holy Cross student, and he was involved in that program also. So I wrote a kind of story about what it was like working with these children in the morning. I remember that, and something about, I think for the newspaper, a kind of correspondent from Washington, D.C. at demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. And so, you know, my own writing in college, not what I read, but my own writing was mostly journalistic, human interest type stories. And it wasn't until I got out of college and got involved with the Poetry Association that I began to really think of myself as writing seriously. And I was also involved with the Women's Center in Worcester, and we had a workshop that met at my house every week, and we put together an anthology called Green Fire Journal, which was just women's poetry, and it was we sold it and gave readings, and then I got involved with the Little Apple magazine through another journalistic venture, the People's Press, which was writing, again, stories about some of the issues in the Worcester community. And when that newspaper was folding, I learned about a kind of community cultural magazine called The Little Apple that was begun by John Dufresne, who's a novelist. And he wasn't at the time. He was running a storefront drop-in center for the Crisis Center in downtown Worcester. And he came up with this idea of this magazine as a project for the people who would drop in there and, to keep them out of trouble. And after the first issue, it kind of, they lost interest, but he wanted to keep it going because he was a writer at heart. And so when the People's Press was closing, people were losing steam for that, we kind of pooled our resources and went to work on the Little Apple magazine, and that became a vehicle for publishing our own work, but also for, promoting arts in the Worcester community and progressive issues, not just in Worcester, but in a larger sense in the larger world. So that's really how I got started. And as far as choosing it, I don't feel like I chose to be a writer. And I'm not sure that people choose to be writers or artists. I think it chooses you. I've given myself many opportunities to quit and taken other kinds of jobs that were professional jobs that I was very good at. I had government jobs. I taught in community centers, created literacy programs, taught English as a second language in the workplace. And I was good at those things, but I kept leaving them to write. And I'd not work for about 6 months, and I'd get scared because I didn't have any money, and then I'd go back to work at another job. And, sometimes, some of these jobs I did for, 5 years at a time, trying to figure out how I was going to write. And I would do things like take, part-time jobs, thinking, oh, I'll have time to write. And then I'd make the part-time job into not just a full-time job, almost a double job. I'd try to make it the best I could. And so it was always competing for my writing time. And it was only when I had a child, I realized I cannot have a job. I can't be an involved parent and also write, because writing is hard work if you're really going to try to be successful at it. And, the writing itself is hard, and then the idea of trying to publish it. So, I think people don't necessarily choose it. Especially creative writing, because very few people are financially successful at it, I think.